Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I was preparing to feed this worm bin here and I was slipping this glove on and I guess I was a little bit too forceful trying to put it on, so unfortunately I guess that means the end of that glove, so I'll have to go fetch another one before I get started. But before I do, I just figured I'd really quickly introduce what's going on here. This here is a bin with some European nightcrawlers in it, and this bin has been in service for 37 days now. I've got some notes over here, so I figured I'd bring them in here and show them to you. So this, like I said earlier, European nightcrawler bin with 37 days under its belt at this point is now due for a feeding after 10 days since the last time we checked in on it. And I guess I just figured I'd really quickly try to depict what's going on here as far as feeding intervals and feeding quantities over this time period. Sometimes I just make reference to, how this is feeding number 5 or something, and that's the case in this case. But I figured I would just, take some notes off of my tracking spreadsheet really quickly and try to depict how frequently this bin has been fed. And here I start the counter on day 0 because when I build a bin, the bin already has a bunch of food built into it. So besides a whole bunch of bedding and grit and moisture, I also lay in some food items so that once the worms get introduced, I already treat that as sort of a pre-fed bin. It's already starting off with feeding number 1. And then in the case of this bin, it was only after 6 days of waiting after the introduction of the worms that I came back into the bin to apply its first feeding after the introduction of the worms. But as you can see here, it's listed as feeding number 2. That's kind of the way I calculate things. And at this point, we're on feeding number 5. So there's been 10 days that have elapsed since the last feeding. The last time we checked in here, it had also been 10 days since the previous feeding. And prior to that, we had waited 11 days. So far, there's been a span of anywhere between 6 to 11 days for the feedings of this bin, and according to my spreadsheet, that averages out to 9.3 days on average intervals between the feedings. And naturally that is proportionally appropriate based on how big of a worm population you have, how large the feedings are that you're providing, what you're feeding in terms of, is it just some sort of a really lightweight type of a food that's just going to go 1, 2, 3, or is it more of a slow kind of burn sort of food? So, there's no clear answer. The question comes up sometimes, hey, how many times do I need to add water to my bin? How many times do I need to add food to my bin? And the correct answer to those questions are always it depends, because it depends on so many different variables. Not only the number of worms you've got and the types of food that you're feeding and the amount of food that you're providing and how much time has elapsed since the last feeding, etc. so on. It could very well depend also on the type of food that you fed last time. Because like last time we came in here, we noticed a whole bunch of leftovers from the previous feeding because that food that had been added back here at feeding number 3 was some stuff that I didn't freeze. The stuff that has been frozen, as it thaws out, it just already has this advantage to being broken down a lot more quickly just because it's been frozen, and that thawing process enables all the microbes and bacteria and fungi and everything to infiltrate the food a lot more quickly, so that natural breakdown process jump starts just as a result of the food having been frozen. So I just thought I'd talk about this topic a little bit since it comes up once in a while in the comments. And I always just enjoy showing my little board here with information about the bin that we're about to work on. So I'm going to go get another glove, slip it on, and we're going to check out how things in this bin are coming along. And after 10 days, I would assume that they're ready for some food. And then I'll head upstairs, bring down something that we could feed the bin with, and get it taken care of. So let's get to work. That's more like it. A nice fully protected hand. And I guess it's not only my hand that I'm protecting, I'm also protecting the contents of the bin so that, instead of me potentially bringing some sort of contaminant into the bin, I'm covering up my hand. So I guess it goes both ways. Just wondering what this is here. Well, doesn't matter. some sort of debris. So it was last week when we checked in here last, I made mention of some leftover foods. And I wonder if some of those leftovers are still in here. That gives them 20 days now. They were pieces of cabbage, and those bits of cabbage were all kind of sliced up into these little thin strips. And last week when we came in here to feed, those pieces looked like they had hardly been touched. So I was kind of glad that I was back into the bin to give the bin some food, because that stuff, you know, just didn't seem like it was going anywhere, and that it would take some time for it to eventually get broken down by the worms. And the food that I added was frozen last time, meaning by now my guess is that that stuff's probably been consumed, and that some of those leftovers that are now 20 days in the bin might still just be sitting here waiting for that chance for the worms to eventually get at them. Look at this little guy. How do you get over there? Get back in the bin. Get back in. Get. All right, what's going on? Stay. So this is just one chunk of that cabbage, and it still has kind of this real fresh kind of feel to it. It's still kind of crunchy and doesn't look like it shows many signs of deteriorating yet. And I'm sure we're going to find a good number of them in here. See, now this is a good sign, I suppose. I think this is also the same stuff, but it's finally becoming sort of liquidy, kind of breaking down, and it definitely has that sort of telltale signature smell of cabbage. A little bit stinky, but not too bad. I guess, you know, I don't mind. I'm kind of a cabbage, I don't know. I like cabbage, basically. I like sauerkraut. I like different cabbage dishes. So some people just don't really favor the smell or taste of cabbage. But I'm glad to see that the bits of cabbage, or at least some of them that we've seen so far, are beginning to break down. I know that some of the pieces that we encountered last time were doing quite the opposite. They were doing... They weren't breaking down. They were actually starting to grow roots. So it almost seemed like the one chunk that had been the stem of the head of cabbage was actually starting to try to grow here within this container. So I'm curious to see if it's still doing that, or if it has finally also started the breakdown process. But I mean, since that first piece that we encountered was a little bit crunchy, a little bit fresh looking still, my guess is that we'll probably find a few more pieces that are still in that fairly fresh stage. But by now, you know, for us to have only bumped into one or two pieces of that cabbage, maybe the stuff has finally gotten broken down and consumed. I had this kind of funny feeling that there might still be leftovers of that, but maybe those few pieces that we already saw are the only ones that we're going to see. No, I doubt it. There was that one really big chunk, the one that had the little stems growing out of it already. I mean, the roots growing out of it already. That piece has still got to be in here. So I'm sure we'll bump into it soon, because it was a fairly large chunk. But I'm definitely glad to see that not only did they appear to have consumed the foods that they received last time, but they've even managed to break down most of what was given to them in the previous feeding as well. I mean, this too here is some sort of a skin, or, you know, some sort of a peel from something. I don't know exactly what it is. And this other thing that we bumped into earlier, that's a mango seed. Mango seed is just another one of those things that you're not going to expect to see break down right away. It's going to take time. But, you know, you can see some of the fibers. It's definitely starting to unravel, and the worms are hopefully starting to break it down. Sometimes I just try to see if I can crack it open and get a look inside of it, but, you know, it'll provide the worms with a source of food for quite some time, but it's something that they just won't be able to break down very quickly. Now, dating back to when I added that cabbage, I also added a bunch of potato peels, which were not frozen either, and I am definitely seeing leftovers of the potato peels in here still too. So I'll be curious to see how long those last. Hopefully by the next feeding, by the next time we come in here, we won't see any of that anymore either. Here's another little chunk of cabbage. But I mean, there was a lot. There were a whole bunch of chunks of this stuff. So I'm really glad to see that for the most part it's broken down. Here we've got, for example, a piece of asparagus, which is also breaking down nicely, but it usually takes a little while. It's one of those things that you'll usually find leftovers of in your worm bins the next time you come in, because it's not one of those things that the worms can do away with very quickly. So the rest of all this stuff is like chunks of cardboard, bedding type materials. So I'm really surprised. You know, I did kind of expect to find that big stem piece that had the roots growing out of it. And the fact that I'm not finding it is a little bit unusual. Maybe it's just off to the side somewhere and we just haven't bumped into it yet. But if they ate that too, that's really awesome. Because they did away with not only all the leftovers from the previous feeding, but for the most part they've done away with all the food that they received last time too. So here too. It's just unusual how some pieces seem like they're holding up so well, but then you don't even see any traces of any of the other stuff. Oh, here's more. Maybe I'm just not looking in the right place. Maybe there is still a whole bunch of this stuff in here still. Because look how fresh this is. It just snaps completely completely fresh, nowhere near the point of breaking down quite yet. So mango seed, I don't know if that's the same one or if we've got two of them floating around in here. This is another piece of asparagus, another piece of cabbage. So I don't know, it's weird, you know. I'm just starting to wonder what the real story is. I think the best bet is going to be for us to just go ahead and apply today's feeding, throw it right down the middle like we usually do, and not worry too much about what the leftovers consist of. I always just kind of go probing around for them because I'm curious, especially when I'm aware of stuff that had been leftovers the previous go around. I'm always curious to see if they finally started making some progress, and if so, how far along are they. So I think after we apply the feeding and we go ahead and cover it up down the middle, maybe we'll go and we'll explore the outer edges of the bin a little bit too to see how things are progressing out there. So here I am trying to peek inside, because this is really just the outer husk of the seed of the mango, and it almost seems like the worms have made their way down into the husk and chewed away at the majority of what was the seed. I don't know, it looks like it's not that broken down yet. It's interesting, sometimes the mango seeds are just, you know, swarming with worms, other times they just take forever and it seems like the worms have very little interest in them. So I was going to head upstairs to the freezer and bring down some food that we can apply, and I guess I'll go with the same portion that I've been applying lately. It's somewhere in the neighborhood of about 2 or 3 handfuls. So I'm going to take a quick break, head upstairs for that now, and then we'll pick up where we left off when I get back. So now the foods that I bought down for them from the freezer, well, not everything's from the freezer, but the stuff that was in the freezer is an entire mango, and it just sat around forever, became kind of nasty and dry looking. A bunch of corn cob that I actually chopped up into little discs, and I've got some frozen baby carrots, and what's not frozen is what you see right over here. This is all these little chunks over here. That's an avocado pit, which I broke into little tiny fragments, so that's not frozen. But you know, that thing, when it was whole, it was about the size of like a pinball, pretty good size spherical seed, which usually takes quite a long time to break down. So lately I've been breaking them up into little chunks, and it's pretty easy to slice it up. I just jammed a really pointy knife into it and, you know, cracked it in half, and then I was able to slice it after that. And naturally what you see here is coffee. So in addition to the foods that they're getting, I'm also going to be laying in a bunch of bedding. So let's grab some of that now. The other thing that I'm noticing here, besides a real lack of leftover foods is hardly any trace of the bedding that I had put in here previously. And as I remember, I had put in quite a bit, because that's just kind of been my theme lately, is putting in lots and lots of bedding. So I'm going to go again with the same concept here. There's a whole bunch of bedding. And let's see, I guess we could start putting some of this food in here. We'll lay that right in the middle. I'll be curious to see what becomes of that. The rest of the food bits, we got carrot. Throw some carrot in here. All these chunks of avocado pit. This soiled piece of paper towel will also come in here nicely as an extra piece of bedding. Here's some more carrots. And these chunks of corn cob. I've definitely found that breaking the corn cob up like this also helps speed things along, because when it's whole, somehow it seems like a whole corn cob takes forever in the worm bins. But when it's chopped up into little discs like this, it definitely gets broken down a lot more quickly than if it wasn't. So now, before we start laying in the coffee, which I'm going to cover up with, I'm going to also sprinkle the food down with some of this crushed eggshell, which is the form of grit that I like to use in my worm bins, because I've always got eggshells around too. Just one of those plentiful items that I'm always looking to get rid of. Just like the coffee, I've always got plenty of coffee laying around. So the coffee is going to go in, as is the coffee filter. Yet another piece of nice bedding to go in right alongside the food. And if I remember correctly, the last feeding also went in with a bunch of paper items alongside the food, and it looks like they just did away with all of it. I've got some fresh leaves over here on the side, so I was thinking maybe I would throw in some of these aged leaves that have been in the bin for a while now to sort of complement the food, because as long as they're nibbling away at the food items that they've been given, they might as well just nibble away at some of the bedding that they've got too. And that's one thing that night crawlers are, I guess, known for too, is their love of bedding. They definitely enjoy eating the bedding that surrounds their food as well. Sometimes you have to wonder if they actually prefer the bedding, because the bedding definitely gets gobbled up quite nicely. So we're going to just start pushing all this outboard material in towards the center. And before we close up shop here, I'm just curious to see how things on the outsides of the bin are doing on these outer edges here. Because where I put the food in is where I'm expecting the majority of the moisture to be. And out here on the sides where there's not been any feedings applied, I just want to make sure that the material is nice and damp and cozy, and that the stuff's not becoming overly dry or harsh or inhospitable for the worms. But it does seem like the material's really nice. It's got a good moisture level to it, so I don't think there's any reason for concern, at least not on this edge. And there's a few worms hanging out in it too. So let's see how things look on the other side. I would assume it's going to be pretty much symmetrical. So let's see if we see the same story out here. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes there's a distinct difference, and then you have to kind of, well, you don't have to, but I'm always the curious type. I'm always curious to see why things aren't progressing evenly and consistently when that's the expectation. And the only mystery remaining here, I believe, is where the heck is that big, huge chunk that was the stem of that head of cauliflower that was in here? Not cauliflower, cabbage. Because we've pretty much gone roaming through the entire bin at this point. And at this point, I would have to assume that even though it was attempting to grow 10 days ago, when we last bumped into it, it must have been positioned in just the right spot to get the attention of the bacteria and the microbes so that it can start becoming like jelly, like that one chunk that we found. And then the worms can gobble it right up. And it was kind of interesting to find one or two pieces which somehow evaded that decomposition process. But I would say for the most part, the cabbage, which had been pretty much still all leftovers last time we were in here, has for the most part pretty much all been eaten up, with the exception of just a couple outlying pieces that somehow survived. So to replace all those leaves that we piled on top of the feeding, we're just going to come in here with a little bit of fresh leafy material to play along with the theme that's going on in all of my bins lately, which is bedding, bedding, bedding. More bedding, the better. And I think it's definitely providing a nice, cozy environment that the worms seem to favor, because, you know, this is definitely a nice, productive bin. You can see that the worms are doing a job on the food they get. Perhaps even a little bit better than I expected them to. So I'm just going to keep up with what I've started here, which is being really generous with the bedding on each go around, and I think that I'm going to be rewarded with some continued good results, which is what I've been observing so far ever since I got into this bedding kick not too long ago. So that pretty much concludes today's video and the feeding of this bin. So hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching.